Our guest today is Carrie Jenkins, who is Associate Professor of Philosophy at the University of British Columbia, Vancouver, and Professorial Fellow at the University of Aberdeen. Carrie, I'm going to start by asking you how you began studying philosophy, and in particular what it was that drew you to philosophy.
So, I guess it's there's a difference between when I started studying it in a formal sense and when I started doing it. So, I can remember at a very early age that I was doing philosophy, or doing what I would now conceive of as philosophy. So particularly, I can remember a very early time in my life. I can't have been more than about like 5 years old, when I was thinking about what I would now call infinite regresses, and the fact that one thing can lead to another. You know, one object might lead to another object, like in the number series, or a question might lead to another question, as in, you know, when we try to explain something, we can keep asking why. And I can remember having the thought that, you know, sometimes that could be okay, right? What we'd now call a virtuous infinite regress at a very early stage. And in a sense, what drew me to the formal study of philosophy was just realizing that that was what that was called. That was the subject where I would be allowed to just continue thinking like that and thinking about these questions. And that happened as I was looking for a degree subject at university. So I had a school teacher sit me down and say, oh, I think you'd be quite good for philosophy, you know, and then never really looked back from that point onwards. One of the things I'm drawn by, or that I love about it, is that basically nothing is in principle irrelevant to the study of philosophy. So, you know, you can think of, I can imagine maybe in some disciplines you might get drawn off into another area by diverging interests, whereas I find with philosophy, if another area of intellectual inquiry seems interesting to me, I can just do the philosophy of that area, intellectual inquiry, and you know, the kinds of generality and the kinds of questions that we ask and think about. It's very, I don't want to say all encompassing because that sounds kind of like we have ownership, but it's very sort of maximally receptive, I think, to input from everywhere else, and that's one of the things that really appeals to me about it.
That's great, thanks. So what do you find to be the most satisfying aspect of your job?
I was wondering actually if I could answer a slightly different question than that one, but I will explain why. So, I wanted to answer what's the most awesome aspect of the job. So, the most awesome aspect of the job is it's about intellectual novelty. So those moments when I encounter or, you know, contribute to something new happening, whether it's the creation of a new theory or a new problem or a question or a new way of conceptualizing something. And the reason that I didn't want to say it's the most satisfying aspect of the job is because sometimes precisely what's valuable about that is it creates dissatisfaction with current ways of thinking or the current answers to the current solutions to a problem. And I think that's you know, that's what motivates people to try find something that will work better. So I think that's the most awesome aspect of my job, but it's not the most satisfying.
I see. The next question was going to be, what is the least satisfying aspect of the job? Maybe what is the least awesome?
Okay. This has to be something to do with, there's just a few areas in which there's a mismatch between what we are trained for as philosophers, and this might apply to academics quite generally actually, what we're trained for and what we're selected for and what we end up doing. And so there are two particular things that come to mind here. One is the pastoral care of students, which I think is a really important responsibility that people have once they are, you know, in a teaching position in a university. But we are never trained for that, and it can be very draining in all sorts of ways, not least emotionally. And then another area where this issue comes up is when academics end up in effectively middle management positions. Let's say when you're the head of a department. And you know, we are never trained to be managers or be line managers of our colleagues, and it's again, it's very draining in various ways. And I think those are. It's not that, you know, everything about those things is unawesome, but that mismatch, I think, is a problem, and I think it's something that philosophers and, you know, academics in general need to try to address.
Thank you. Could you give us a sense of what your current projects are?
There are a lot. So I tend to work in a sort of massively parallel way. And I kid myself that it's because of the holistic interactions between everything, but really it's because I have a very bad attention span and I need to rotate. So some of the things that I'm most centrally trying to focus on at the moment, so I have an ongoing interest in issues around the a priori. So this means areas where it seems like we have knowledge of facts about the world, but it seems like we didn't come to that knowledge through experience, through using our senses. So a lot of people think that mathematics, for example, is like this, or that logic is like this. We just sit and think about it. We can work out that 2 + 2 = 4. We don't have to go to the lab or smush things together or go and see and check whether 2 + 2 = 4. You just think about it. So these areas of supposedly a priori knowledge this is one part of philosophy that really fascinates me. I have some ongoing projects in that area. Particularly, I'm just starting up right now a collaborative paper with my colleague Masashi Kasaki at UBC, and we're looking at some work by Al Casulo and Timothy Williamson, both of whom are also in this interview series. And what the interplay between those two is doing, we think, is bringing to light some really interesting features about the debate about the a priori. So there's this sort of idea that there's a traditional way of conceptualizing what the a priori is, and then there's some supposedly radical criticisms of it from people like Williamson. And what we're trying to do is sort of pick up on to what extent the radical criticisms are radical and what the traditional conception really consisted in. Another big project that I have on the go at the moment is around the nature of explanation. And in particular, the nature of explanation itself, but also particularly its application within philosophy and how important it is in understanding philosophical questions to understand what explanation is and how it works. So, for example, when we think about questions like realism, whether there is a mind-independent physical world, for example, I think what we're asking about is whether the facts about the physical world are explained by what goes on in our minds, that would be the mind-dependent case, or not. So I think that notion of explanation, whether that explanation relation holds, is crucial to understanding what the realism debate's actually getting at. So I think if we have a better understanding of what explanation is in the first place, we can then apply it to understanding areas like this. And I think that's one example, but I think this is actually prevalent all over philosophy, all kinds of questions where secretly explanation is really doing a lot of the work. But explanation itself is such a difficult concept because what counts as an explanation is so sensitive to context, to who the audience of the explanation is supposed to be, what do they know already, and things like that. What can we assume is a sort of common background, and what were they interested in, right? So there's this sort of bundle of problems about what explanation is, and the hope is if we make some progress with those, we can make some progress with all the areas of philosophy where explanation is either explicitly or tacitly at work. So that's that's a kind of grand ambition. That's going to be a book project for the next few years. That's probably enough.
Thank you. So finally, our last question concerns the fact that funding bodies in the UK in particular are encouraging various disciplines in the humanities to explain how they have a beneficial impact on society outside of academia. So I was wondering whether you agree with this approach and whether you think that philosophy can have this kind of beneficial impact.
So I think there are sort of two ways of construing both this question and more generally the government agendas that stand behind it. And I call one of them the positive way and one of them the negative way. And I really want to stand behind one of them, and I really want to distance myself from the other one. So the positive way of thinking about this stuff is thinking it's a question about whether there's something that philosophers can and should be contributing to society in order to just enrich cultural dialogue and people's thought processes, giving them skills for criticism and thinking. And I think that's absolutely great, fantastic. Of course we can and we should. Caveat to that, I think that's sometimes construed as a kind of one-way street, like as if philosophers should just come out of their ivory towers, get into the street or into the TLS or whatever, and go, hear ye. And I think, I think that's fine, and it's good that some of them do that. But I think it's also important that it actually be a dialogue, because, as I was saying, one of the important things about philosophy is its sensitivity to its receptivity to a wide variety of different points of view and ways of thinking. And there's actually a lot that we can gain by talking to people who look at things very differently than we do. So I think that's the sort of positive construal of how it can be a very good thing that we're trying to have an impact and indeed be impacted on. Then there's a sort of negative construal, which is philosophy needs to justify itself by doing this. Otherwise, it isn't valuable. So if it can't have an impact, it shouldn't be done. It shouldn't be funded. And that, I think, is a very dangerous thought, because I think it has a tendency to squash intellectual freedom and intellectual creativity. And I also think it's just sort of impossible to apply in any reasonable way, because it's very hard to say actually in intellectual endeavour generally, but certainly in philosophy, it's very hard to say what, if anything, is going to have an impact where and how and when, and it could be only over hundreds of years that we notice these things. So, the idea that we could make funding decisions based on how much of an impact something is having or will have is very strange to me, and I think potentially dangerous in the ways that I mentioned. But I think, the idea that we should be taking ideas out there and getting impact from other people, that idea, I think, is a good one. That shouldn't discombobulate us in any way. The negative construal, I think we should be very worried about that.
Thank you very much. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.